In the early hours of May 2, 2026, thousands of people arrived at airports across the United States and found something they had never seen before. Spirit Airlines counters were closed. There were no agents. There were no flight information screens. There was nobody. Just a printed sign taped up that said all flights had been permanently canceled. In a matter of hours, nearly 17,000 employees lost their jobs. Thousands of passengers were stranded, and an entire fleet of yellow planes was grounded at various airports across the country without a destination, without crew, without a future. Spirit Airlines had ceased to exist. But the most disconcerting thing wasn't that it had closed. The most disconcerting thing was that just 10 years earlier, Spirit had been considered one of the most efficient and profitable airlines in the entire American industry. What exactly happened? How did an airline that dominated the market end up disappearing? And above all, why did a $3.8 billion offer that seemed to save Spirit end up becoming the beginning of its end? In the next few minutes, you will understand how an airline that for years forced the entire market to lower its prices ended up collapsing due to a combination of its own decisions, external shocks, and a regulatory irony that very few people know about. And in the end, you'll understand why its disappearance could directly affect the price of your next flight. The incredible thing is that Spirit didn't go bankrupt because people stopped flying with it. In fact, for years, the exact opposite happened. To understand why, we have to go back to 2006. Then a new CEO named Ben Baldanza arrived and made a decision that would completely change the future of the company. He turned Spirit into America's first major ultra-low-cost airline. The idea was simple and brutal at the same time. The ticket only covered the seat, nothing else. Carry-on luggage, checked bags, seat selection, drinks, snacks, everything was charged separately. If you wanted something extra, you paid for it. If you didn't want to pay for it, you traveled with the bare minimum. Many people mocked it. The media called it the worst airline in America. Social media made it synonymous with discomfort and unpleasant surprises. But the planes were flying full. Because there was one detail that no one could ignore. Spirit sold tickets that sometimes cost $50, $80, even $100 less than any competitor on the same route. And that changes everything. Within the industry, talk soon began of something called the Spirit effect. Every time the yellow airline announced its entry into a new route, the prices of other airlines immediately plummeted. Delta, American, and United couldn't afford to lose passengers simply because Spirit appeared offering the same route for much less. Spirit didn't sell cheap tickets out of generosity. It could genuinely afford to sell them cheaper than almost any other airline. How did he do it? Spirit had built a machine obsessed with reducing costs. It operated virtually the same type of aircraft across its entire fleet, carried more passengers per flight than most of its competitors, and kept its aircraft in the air for more hours per day. The result was brutal. Spirit could sell tickets much cheaper than any other airline and still make money. For years, that formula seemed unbeatable. But the major airlines were watching, and they began to respond. Delta, American, and United launched what they called basic economy fares. These were initially very inexpensive tickets, designed to appear in the same search engines as Spirit and compete directly on price. And here's something happened that completely changed the landscape. When a passenger searched for a flight on platforms like Google Flights or Expedia and saw that Delta was offering a price only $10 or $15 more than Spirit, the decision was no longer so obvious. Because those extra dollars gave you a more recognized brand, access to frequent flyer programs, better cancellation policies, and at least a minimum level of in-flight service. Spirit's proposal no longer felt unique. Its biggest competitive advantage began to slowly erode. But the model still worked. The airline still had room to compete. And although no one knew it yet, something was happening in the background that would end up completely changing Spirit's future. In 2020, the pandemic brought the global airline industry to a standstill. And for Spirit, the impact was particularly severe for a specific reason. His business depended almost entirely on holiday travelers, tourists looking for cheap flights to Florida, Las Vegas, Cancun, the Caribbean. People who could simply decide not to travel if there was economic or health uncertainty. That made it hugely vulnerable compared to airlines like Delta or United, which also relied on corporate travelers, air cargo revenue, and lucrative credit card deals linked to their loyalty programs. Spirit didn't have any of those protections. When summer 2021 arrived and travel demand exploded, it seemed Spirit was poised for a comeback. Planes filled up again. Tourist destinations saw record bookings. It was exactly the scenario Spirit had been designed for. But behind that apparent recovery, the finances continued to deteriorate because the world Spirit was returning to was completely different from the one he had left. Spirit still had options, but not many anymore. And soon an offer would appear that would completely change the course of history. Fuel prices had risen. Pilot and crew salaries had increased. Manufacturers were accumulating delays in delivering new aircraft. And a pilot shortage was hitting the entire industry. For an airline that sold the cheapest tickets on the market, aggressively raising prices wasn't a realistic option. Its customers were extremely price sensitive. If Spirit raised fares, many simply chose another airline. It was a perfect trap. And then another problem appeared that almost no one saw coming. The Pratt & Whitney engines powering Spirit's Airbus A320neo aircraft, its most modern planes, began experiencing serious problems related to contamination of metallic materials during the manufacturing process. Authorities mandated widespread inspections. As a result, at the height of the crisis, nearly 40 Spirit aircraft were grounded. 40 planes grounded, with fixed costs unchanged, not generating a single dollar of revenue. For an airline whose entire model depended on keeping its planes in the air as much as possible, that was devastating. And that's when the company started running out of possible moves. And it was precisely at that moment of maximum weakness that a multi-billion-dollar offer appeared. Spirit's management tried to find a way out. They negotiated a merger with Frontier Airlines, another ultra-low-cost carrier with a similar fleet and customer base. On paper, it made sense. Together, they could create a larger, more efficient airline, better able to compete with the major carriers. Then something unexpected happened. It was probably the last real opportunity to change course. JetBlue appeared with an offer of $3.8 billion. It was much more money than Frontier was offering. For the shareholders, it seemed like an obvious decision, but there was a problem. Many within Spirit believed that the deal would never be approved. Spirit's model. It didn't want to keep the tickets cheap or continue with the ultra-low-cost philosophy. What it was really after were the planes, the certified pilots, and slots at strategic airports. Spirit's own executives publicly warned that the merger would likely never receive government approval. And they were right. The U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit to block the deal. The argument was clear. If Spirit disappeared as an independent airline, the Spirit effect would also disappear. And that would hurt millions of consumers who relied on its low fares to fly. In January 2024, a federal judge ruled in favor of the regulators and canceled the merger. The government had prevented Spirit from disappearing, but he didn't yet know that he had just left her alone. And here lies the greatest irony of this whole story. The decision that sought to protect cheap tickets for consumers ended up generating exactly the opposite result. By preventing Spirit from being taken over by an airline with greater financial resources, the government left the company alone to face a crisis it could no longer cope with on its own. Spirit attempted to reorganize under Chapter 11 bankruptcy in November 2024. It reduced its fleet, renegotiated contracts, and tried to modify its business model by launching all-inclusive fares to attract a different type of passenger. But that completely confused their market. Its traditional customers, those solely focused on the lowest possible price, began to drift away because Spirit no longer seemed so cheap. And higher-spending travelers didn't come either as they continued to prefer airlines with loyalty programs and better benefits. Spirit had destroyed his own identity in an attempt to survive. The final blow came in early 2026, when geopolitical tensions in the Middle East caused a sharp increase in international fuel prices. For any airline, that's a serious problem. For Spirit, which was already operating at the absolute limit of its financial capabilities, it was unsustainable. The company tried to secure emergency funding. It explored potential government support. It held talks that never resulted in any concrete agreement. And on May 2, 2026, with no other options available, Spirit Airlines simply stopped flying. 34 years in operation, a fleet of nearly 200 aircraft, 17,000 employees, an airline that for years forced the entire U.S. market to compete on price. The most incredible thing is that Spirit didn't disappear because nobody wanted to fly with her, nor because their tickets were too cheap. He disappeared because he bet his future on a single decision. And when he discovered he had been wrong, it was already too late. The consequences are already being felt. Spirit's planes are being reassigned to other carriers. The most profitable routes are being taken over by competitors. But the smaller routes, those that connected mid-sized cities with affordable tourist destinations, are simply disappearing. And the effect that all regulators wanted to protect, that Spirit effect that kept prices low across the industry, no longer exists. The story of Spirit is not just the story of an airline that went out of business. It's the story of a model that worked for decades, outlasted larger competitors, withstood market crises, and was ultimately brought down by a combination of its own mistakes, regulatory decisions with unforeseen consequences, and external shocks that all came at once. The question that remains is whether Spirit was an isolated case or if it is just the first sign of something bigger coming to the airline industry. If the world of aviation sparks your curiosity, I've included another video on screen for you to discover more.